Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, as the regular, fairly consistent viewer, or let's be real, the person who watches all of 2 minutes of these videos and then stops to go watch the latest Lizeth video or what have you, has probably observed that we cover a wide variety of books here on this channel. And that's because, again, I have a largely eclectic taste when it comes to reading. I like to read, well, just anything and everything. I really don't have any books that I go out of my way to avoid. And so, because of that, I have a tendency to stumble on some books that are okay. And then some other books that are like, hey, that was pretty good. And some books that are great. And then some books that make me go, huh, that was weird. That was really weird. Why was that weird? I'm going to have to read that again just to figure it out. And I don't really think there's any comic that just sort of embodies that kind of aesthetic response quite so much as Frank by Jim Woodring. Now, if you've never encountered Frank before, that honestly doesn't surprise me. The Frank books were kind of a phenomenon during the kind of late 90s and the early aughts, but at the same time, what's most important about Frank is that it's kind of established a cult following. It never really hit a lot of mainstream readers. It was this sort of character and world which existed a lot of times, not necessarily on the underground level, but very much on the sort of outside the mainstream. But at the same time, there is a quality to Frank comics that I can only describe as Frank. And hopefully by the end of this video, I'll be able to convey that, and I won't have to try to stumble around for a qualifying description of it. The only thing I can say is Frank comics are Frank comics, and the author, Jim Woodring, has established a really solid career making these Frank comics and making them just as weird and odd and wonderful as they could possibly be. Now, when we're talking about Frank comics overall, there's actually several collections of Frank comics. So a lot of these tended to be sort of solid, independent stories, and in fact, this book, the one that we're going to talk about today, the Frank book, which is put out by Fantagraphic Books, want to make sure I read it right. Yes, Fantagraphic Books is effectively a compendium. I'm not going to call this a bound trade per se, because Frank never came out the way, say, an Aquaman comic book might come out, or the way a Wonder Woman comic book came out. Rather, you got sort of small snippets of Frank in other magazines. Magazines like Heavy Metal, magazines like what have you. And so Frank has sort of steadily had presence throughout the medium of comics and comic periodicals. What this book does is it compiles effectively a kind of best of, though honestly even that doesn't do the book justice, because with Frank each story is just so weird and bizarre and significant, and continuity doesn't really mean all that much. So really what this book tries to do is just sort of collect a bunch of the independent Frank comics, as well as some of Jim Woodring's sort of personal artwork, and then as well some of the actual Frank comics which have been colored, which, as I'll talk about here in a second, most Frank comics are predominantly black and white. That's it. There's not even any grayscale or anything like that. It's gorgeous artwork. But for the reader who's approaching this book, you don't have to have a lot of background with Frank. You don't have to know about underground comic movements and sensibilities. The wonderful thing about Frank is it's incredibly approachable. I'm not going to lie, this is a weird book, even by my standards, even by the standard of somebody who's read Arkham Asylum on repeat just about every year. Frank is a strange book, but God, it's so cool and interesting. So let's stop talking about the book and start talking about the book and tackle what may in fact be a kind of Herculean task when I say, what is Frank about? We'll find out. Okay. So, I've done a little bit of introduction, and you'll note, of course, I didn't give you a sort of in-depth background about the history of Frank Comics and the history of Jim Woodring. That's because, as always, I don't know a lot about it. Or, to the very extent, I don't know enough to feel that I could communicate to you, the reader, the details of it. I'll probably post the Wikipedia article to Frank and Jim Woodring in the comment section below. I know Wikipedia still has a dirty sound to it from your high school teachers, but trust me, as somebody who works in the library and is encouraging people to check out information, Wikipedia is a good starting ground. And if nothing else, you then go down to the reference section where they've got hyperlinks to all sorts of books and articles that give you a lot better information about it. But again, as always, this channel is also about trying to understand various comics works and how they work. It's not so much about trying to do a history of comics, because there's already tons of people on the internet doing that. And especially when we're talking about Frank. Frank has had a tremendous amount of influence upon generation after generation of cartoonists that have encountered it. The introduction of this book is actually done by Francis Ford Coppola, who says it outright. There really is not a book quite like Frank. And it's one of these moments that I hear somebody do a little blurb like that and go, okay, yeah, whatever. It's true. You're never going to encounter a book quite like Frank. And to sort of hopefully illustrate that to you, let's take a quick look at one of the stories in this collection. One of them is the story High Rise Hopper. Now, we have Frank, the character right here. You'll note he's a kind of anthropomorphic mouse cat-esque character. Trying to come up with a solid definition of what Frank actually is just damn near close to impossible. But we also have his sidekick. I have to pull it up because one of the nice things about this collection is Woodring gives you like a list of all the characters, their names. I apologize for how glossy this paper is. It's going to make some of these presentations difficult. But we have Frank and the character of Pupshaw taking a walk through a temple. This is one of the aspects of Frank that you're just going to have to get used to, is for whatever reason, the world he exists in is just populated by temples. Now, during this walk, Pupshaw and Frank encounter this sort of demonoid, snoid-esque figure who winds up looking a bit like a carnival mask. His name is Wim. And one of the interesting things about Wim is, again, there's not so much about continuity, but he often tends to be a sort of wizard, technician, engineer who's often causing mischief and occasionally acting in sadism. We see him suddenly appear around a corner, and he walks up to Frank, and he begins twisting a machine around. Well, Pupshaw immediately reacts, as you can see, by chasing after Wim, biting him, and then spitting out what appears to be a kind of leech or worm. Now, Woodring refers to these things often as jivas. They're effectively, as he says, are conditioned souls, temporarily confined to the liberating prison of radial symmetry. You're going to encounter small, what are they again, jivas throughout the story of Frank. But following this jiva, it pops out of Wim, Pupshaw runs after it, and then we see the jiva hop around Pupshaw, hop behind Frank, and then immediately hop up into Frank. Part of me thinks that may be implying his ass, but it's also implying just his tail. And then you can see thereafter what takes place is the jiva causes Frank to undergo, moderately speaking, a dramatic restructuring of his body, nervous system, what have you. Pupshaw, being the beloved pet of Frank, immediately reacts, chews Frank's new body until eventually the jiva pops out. It hops around, eventually sitting on a branch where it hisses some dirty language. Frank goes back to normal, and then the walk continues. What just happened? I don't know. That's literally an entire story in and of itself. Frank and Pupshaw take a walk, they encounter Wim, Wim gets eaten, kind of, but not really. A jivas pops out of his body, bounces around, hops inside of Frank. Frank turns into some sort of leech, worm, nerve net creature. Pupshaw attacks him, the jivas pops out, Frank goes back to normal, and they resume basically as if nothing had happened? What? Let's take another story. So there's another character that sort of constantly, Frank constantly encounters throughout the book. His name is Manhog. He is exactly as the title would suggest. He's literally just a pig with a man's body. Now, one day, Frank is walking around with Jerry Hen. There's actually several of these chickens characters that exist throughout the universe of Frank. And you can see they're going around, they take a walk, and they encounter just this odd bowl that has, as we eventually learn, fireworks in them. The Jerry Hen decides, hey, what do you say we light some up, and let's actually light them up around Man-Hog. The Jerry Hen decides to tie it to Man-Hog's body, his tail specifically, lights it up, and as you can observe, Man-Hog freaks out. The fireworks hurt him, torture him. He goes running for miles on end until he eventually just finds himself kind of lost until he eventually reaches a temple in the middle of nowhere. See how I told you that'd be a recurring motif? And then he encounters what would appear to us a kind of garden. It's a safe haven from the pain and the hurt that he had experienced up to that point. At one point he discovers the garden holds a fountain, but while he's drinking, we observe he encounters what can only be described as a shadow. This is just some sort of nameless humanoid figure that is composed entirely of darkness, of shadow. He tries to help Man-Hog out. He takes him deeper into the garden, he takes him into the home, he gives him a bath, he gives him some food, and then, as the story progresses, we see him begin to let Man-Hog live in the garden. He shows him how to tend to flowers. He encourages Man-Hog into expressing his creativity. More time passes by, we see that Man-Hog begins to walk on his hind legs. He begins to wear clothes. He begins to study astronomy and mathematics. Man-Hog is doing laundry, developing his sort of individual cultivation, to the point that he eventually sort of becomes his own human being. And then, all at once, we observe something is happening to the shadow. The shadow, we eventually find out, is dying. Man-Hog, who has come to see this figure as a kind of friend, a companion, a benefactor, slowly takes care of him, but as we observe in possibly one of the most tragic scenes of this book, the shadow just melts away, leaving Man-Hog to himself. Well, that may be the end of it, but one day while Man-Hog is resting on the terrace reading a book, he sees Frank out of the corner of his eye. He invites him up to the temple, he shows him his food, they have a nice little party, and then Man-Hog decides, hey, you stay here for a little bit, I'll be back. Man-Hog goes for the day, leaves Frank to the couch and the fine fruit and everything, and then he decides to throw Frank a small little party, and he surprises him with none other than the Jerry Chicken who caused him the original pain. What just happened? Okay, so, yeah, when I said this book is weird, and this book is peculiar, and I've never read anything like it, hopefully that explains what I was talking about. Trying to describe what Frank is about is really impossible. Really, what this book tends to be is a series of small stories in which Frank just sort of encounters the world around him. He'll make choices that can lead to personal ruin or personal fortune or success. Sometimes it will be success at the expense of others. People will get hurt. People will die. He'll find objects in the middle of nowhere that suddenly are filled with living organisms or send him on these bizarre journeys. When we're talking about Frank, the best really word I've got for it is kind of like a trip. I may go so far as to say meditation. Really what Jim Woodring is doing with these comics is just telling a sort of meandering story. It doesn't necessarily begin or end. Ultimately, when the reader reads these stories, they're encountering just the nature of being and how weird Frank's reality is. And I believe, ultimately, it's some way of trying to communicate the oddity of our own lives. Because when we think about just one single day, we have to really think about who are the people that we've encountered. What are the experiences that we've had in the course of a day? And that they make sense. And that's one of the things I really love about Frank, is going into this book, if you're trying to find something like a coherent or traditional narrative, you're just going to be disappointed. What's really fun about Frank is it's pretty much just pure potential. Again, Jim Woodring will throw in a plot, he'll throw in a message, he'll throw in an action, and he'll just let the characters react to it. So rather than trying to tell a story of getting from one place and ending in another, Frank is really just a story about being, and a character who tends to resemble a lot of the kind of like mouse-esque characters that some of us appreciated in our youth and then eventually grew to despise. But what's interesting about Frank is that it's not anything close to a recognizable narrative. It's a chance to just sort of be in a comic. And I really don't know any other way to describe what is the content of this book. You really, and I know this sounds cliche, but hopefully those two stories are enough to show you, you really just have to experience Frank. Because that's pretty much the only way you're ever really going to understand what the hell is Frank? And now, with all that, my best work so far to explain this weird and wonderful book, let's talk about why, formally, Frank is amazing, and how anybody who appreciates comics and wants to make comics or just read a great comic really needs to take the time to pick up a copy of the Frank book. Okay, so I gave you a lot to process there. Hopefully I didn't completely sort of throw you off with just that long description, or just those long reading stories. But one of the things I just wanted to convey to you is the fact that one of the most interesting aspects of this book, and in fact of just Jim Woodring's work, period, is that it's often akin to a kind of acid trip, and sometimes it's just a meditation in and of itself. It's not so much about getting from a particular point and ending at another particular point. Instead, it's simply an effort to just sort of be, and sort of be with Frank as he just sort of encounters all of these oddities one after another. One after another, not the another. Blech. It's like the Google, or the Facebook, or the Walmart. You know. Anyway, words, what are those? Hopefully something else, though, that sort of maybe I didn't convey enough during the content, but hopefully something you noticed was there were no dialogue balloons in the story. That's because Frank is entirely a silent comic. As you can observe, page after page after page, we will have Frank reacting, we will have Frank making actions, we will have Frank moving from place to place and encountering new worlds. But over and over and over again, Jim Woodring gives us an entirely silent universe. Now, if you look down here, we can perceive that Frank is screaming, and we can probably imagine the sound of him screaming. But he doesn't give us a dialogue balloon. Jim Woodring works entirely from a non-dialogue driven work. And that's one of the most difficult aspects, I would argue, of trying to describe Frank. Because it enhances the idea that these characters are not really about taking you to a particular place. It's not about getting you somewhere. It's just about being with the characters, which is really unique and interesting because most comics aren't designed that way. If you look at, say, I Hate Fairyland, we have a very solid premise. A little girl, when she's about 12 years old, gets transported to a magical world, fairyland, and then she stays there for about 30 years and loses her mind and then steadily tries to just get out of fairyland. That's about beginning with a character and getting that character to a particular goal. And one of the things, again, about I Hate Fairyland is it's driven largely through dialogue. That's a way of creating the characters within the reader's mind. You become associated with certain dialogue structures. You become familiar with certain rhythms. With Frank, you don't have dialogue, and we forget sometimes how important dialogue is as a way to anchor us to a character. You expect Batman to talk a certain way. You expect, say, Robert Crumb to talk a certain way. You expect Tom of Fitton. Well, no, actually, that's a bad example. But you expect the characters of 5,000 kilometers per second to talk a certain way. With Frank, you're dealing with an entirely silent set of characters. So in this way, it's almost like watching a silent movie, but even silent movies had small moments where you would see the dialogue of the characters. Jim Woodring places a lot of weight on his characters because the reader has to follow all of the visual cues presented in the book. So in this particular instance where we see Pupshaw and their puppies watching Manhog try to steal a vase off of the shelf, again, we can determine by the body posture, the motions of the characters, and then as well, just small, subtle elements in the background structure to sort of move us forward in the plot. We can perceive, just by looking at these two pages, that Pupshaw is seeing Manhog's shadow, she observes Manhog stealing the vase, and then she then orders her pups to chase after him, and then in this later scene, when the pups do start to chase after him, Manhog's reaction communicates to the reader, oh, he's shocked. we have to effectively create our own sounds in the comic. And that's something most readers really are not that familiar with, or at least not a lot of contemporary readers. But even then, when we talk about comics, the word balloon has been a way of communicating time passing. And so one of the most interesting aspects of Frank's to me is the fact that he places a lot of burden upon the reader to try to create the world that he's often just showing with exquisite detail. And on the note of that, I noted before, Frank is drawn entirely in black and white, which means that all of these moments where you see shadowing, that's just lines. Jim Woodring puts so much detail into these comics. There are simple panels like these top three where we sort of see Frank talking to a Jivas that that's been pulled out of a nethersphere by whim. But one of the interesting things about Jim Woodring, too, is the fact that he knows how to use the length and arrangement of the panels to create an effect. We've followed Frank and this weird little Jivas as they've been going about their day. Eventually, the Jivas finds a little hole to which it can go return to its original netherworld. Just absorb these pages for a moment, and you can see just a general comic panel layout. There's not that much distinction. He's arranging with the sizing of the panels to create scene, time moving forward, place, and space. We feel pretty level in this world. We turn one page, and we find ourselves entirely somewhere else. And hopefully, looking at this, you can observe what I'm talking about when I say that Frank comics exist in a world that is just so unique and bizarre and beautiful and wonderful. Like, you can stare at this 2-page panel spread for hours and just appreciate how much detail is going into it. And if I can just zoom in a little closer, again, when it's far away, you're like, okay, he's using a lot of really good inking strategies here in order to communicate shadows. He is. He's using nothing but black lines to emphasize textures, to emphasize space, to emphasize perspective. So when we talk about Frank, it's really an excellent opportunity to observe how the visual aspects of style can really create a dramatic aesthetic effect on the reader. Because looking at those two panels, you feel the space. You feel all those Jivas just swimming around and freaking Frank out. You're hopefully with Frank going, oh my god, what the hell is this? And then also, when we talk about panel layouts, again, one thing that Jim Woodring really needs to get credit for is the way that he does know how to use panel arrangements to communicate aspects of his world. So in this panel spread here, we see this frog wearing a turban and I assume it's a tunic. I don't want to say kilt, because a lot of Woodring's sort of visual aesthetic tends to have more of a kind of like Middle Eastern Asian quality aesthetic to it. It's one of these small little details that I haven't sort of deconstructed as much as I would like to, but that's another video for the future. But looking at this page here, we can observe how just this arrangement can really help affect the reader, because we can perceive already, just from some of the visual cues, Frank is looking over here at the Jivas, we see the frog is absorbed in their book, and then we can just feel the big open space. He's leading us up to what will eventually be the confrontation in which Frank and the frog bump into each other, which then causes a fight, which then causes the Jivas to, well, eat the frog. It's a very heavy scene. But again, if you look at just these 3 panels alone, the reader doesn't have to anticipate it. They can kind of feel the eventual conflict. And there again, by creating a larger panel when set against smaller panels, he's able to bring more attention to the scene. There's just example after example I could give of Woodring's ability as a cartoonist. And one more thing I really want to talk about is his ability to communicate action really well. Again, there's no dialogue in this graphic novel, like not a single word. Like even when the characters are screaming or yelling, he doesn't even do an exclamation point to go, oh my gosh. He stays away from that structure. So it's ultimately through physical action that Jim Woodring is able to achieve a lot of what he does. So if you take a look at this page here, Frank has bought this magical top that when you sort of pull the string and start it up, it spins in the air really, really quickly, we can see Manhog going, ooh, this looks really cool. And then in the last 3 panels, we observe Manhog being spun through the air and striking the earth and being sort of pushed through the mud and the dirt as he's just holding on for his bare life before eventually being thrown off. It's a really interesting structure, and we have to observe, we can feel this motion, not simply because the reader's been giving some of these small lines to indicate the motion, but we have Manhog sort of turning into this dramatic blur that's composed of only just a couple of small lines. Again, Woodring does a lot of physical work in this book in order to convey emotion, in order to convey action. And so anybody who is interested in comics really needs to take a chance and read the Frank book, or any of the books in which Woodring has published about the character of Frank and then his girlfriend Fran. That book, by the way, is excellent. I don't own a copy of it, sad for me, but I hope to talk about it one day on the channel. When we talk about the Frank book, visually, this book is a marvel, and I could talk about it for hours, clearly. But what I really hope that I've conveyed to you is the fact that Woodring is really interesting from a narrative and content perspective, but then also from a visual perspective. He knows how to use comics in order to convey information, to convey action, to convey emotion and tone, and his line work is what sells just about every single panel of this book. Visually, Frank is just a golden opportunity to see what you can do in comics, and it contributes so much to the medium. I can't say enough about this book, but I need to stop because I'm at 10 minutes, so let's do the last hurrah and call it a day. Okay, the Frank book by Jim Woodring. What is it? It's a collection of shorts, a collection of various Frank comics which have appeared, as the opening copyright page suggests, in magazines like Pulse, Heavy Metal, Hyena, Measles, The Millennium, Whole Earth Catalog, Pictopia, Snake Eyes, The Stranger, and Tantalizing Stories. Frank has appeared in dozens of comics, and it's because of this exposure that Jim Woodring has developed a kind of cult following. And it also doesn't help that when we talk about Frank, he's an interesting character. He's very reminiscent of figures like Goofy and Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny. They're characters that were anthropomorphized and they were iconic, so we were allowed to sort of imprint on these characters. And then it also didn't help that the content of the story being what it is, we just follow this iconic character as he just sort of encounters the world. There really isn't a definitive story in terms of the Frank book. Rather, we get a series of experiences that we can just sort of ride along with, and hopefully, if we're really in tune with the experience, we can laugh at them, we can cry at them, we can just sort of be in the moment. And then in terms of what the Frank book offers to just the medium of comics, period, there's just so much to say. Woodring is an incredible artist. He's able to do a lot through implication, through physical action, through demonstrations of emotion, through his careful line work. There is so much visual work going on in the Frank book that anybody who gives even just 3 shits about comics really needs to sit down, pick up a copy of this book, and read it for themselves, and just experience the oddity that is this wonderful collection. I have every intention of slowly amassing as many Frank books as I can get my hands on and covering them here on the channel. And in fact, I actually at one point was planning to do just that. I'm looking around because, oh yeah, there it is. At my local library, we actually had one of the Frank books. It was actually my first experience to it, The Complete Frank. This is a wonderful introduction to the character, and I would definitely recommend it. In fact, I probably will sometime in the future just do it for this channel, because it's a great introduction to Frank, his world, and some of his best stories. But if you really want to just dig into Frank, I would definitely recommend the Frank book, because not only do you get the black and white comics, you also get some of the colored comics that he did. I didn't really talk about them as much because I honestly don't like them as much as the black and white stuff, but they're still really interesting. And then, of course, at the very end, you get some of Jim Woodring's personal artwork, which I cannot stress enough. It is beautiful and gorgeous. And part of the appeal of this book is just opening it up sometimes and staring at these gorgeous images that are just spellbinding as they are magical. The Frank book is. Let's just put it at that. Okay, I'm going to call it a day there. Thank you so much for watching. As always, it means a lot to me. I'm nothing short of amazed that there are people who want to listen to me talk for half an hour about comics of all things. But hey, whoever you are, I love you, I think you're cute, and don't listen to what Stephanie tells you, okay? You can totally work that top, okay? She's just jealous right now, you know, because ever since her boyfriend left, she's been super bitter, and you look great, and your life is together, so don't listen to her. Anyway, please like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know that you're enjoying these videos, that you want to see more, or maybe you just want more videos and more content so that you can laugh your ass off at what a ridiculous loser I am. But I mean, hey, you know, whatever works for you. Like I said, I'll just post a link to the Wikipedia page for Jim Woodring and Frank down below. It's a good way to sort of start your research. And then don't forget, when it comes to Frank comics, check out your local comic book shop, because even if they don't have the Frank book or some other like compendium of Frank, they may have some of the magazines like Heavy Metal where Frank actually made some of his appearances in. And then also don't forget, it's Fantagraphics. Most comic book shops should be able or should have a retailer that they can get out in contact with. So go to your local comic book shop, check it out, see if you can find a copy. If they don't have it, also never forget, you know, you live in the United States, I assume, or even just the world period. You probably, whether you realize it or not, have access to a local public library. And your local public library may have a comic book section or a graphic novel section. And if they don't have it, put it in an interlibrary loan form. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. Go read some comics.